Mother of billionaire rips poor black maid's uniform. Billionaire's reaction shocks all. The sound of fabric tearing cut through the silence like a scream. Grace stood perfectly still in the center of Marcus Worthington's private study, her eyes fixed on the marble floor beneath her feet. She didn't look up, didn't move, didn't breathe louder than a whisper. She just felt Victoria Worthington's manicured fingers tighten around the collar of her uniform and pull, hard. The starched white fabric, pressed so carefully just this morning that the creases could cut paper, gave way with a sickening rip. "You think I don't see what you're doing?" Victoria's voice shook with a fury that made the crystal decanters on the shelf rattle. Her face, usually frozen in that practiced smile of old money and country club luncheons, twisted into something unrecognizable, something ugly. "You think you can waltz into my son's life, into my home, and just seduce your way out of the gutter you crawled from?" Grace's hands remained at her sides even as every instinct screamed at her to protect herself, to push away, to run. But running would confirm Victoria's accusations. Fighting back would give her ammunition. So Grace did the only thing she could. She breathed. Slow and steady, the way her mother had taught her when the world pressed too hard against her chest and tried to suffocate hope. "Mrs. Worthington, Grace's voice emerged barely louder than a whisper. "Don't." Another pull. Another tear. The sound echoed off the leather-bound books lining the walls, books that had probably cost more than Grace would earn in 5 years of cleaning these floors. "Don't you dare speak to me like you're my equal." Victoria's free hand gestured wildly at Grace's face, her body, her existence in this room that smelled of expensive cologne and older money. "You clean toilets. You scrub my floors. And you will not trap my son with whatever pathetic scheme this is." Grace felt something hot slide down her cheek. Not from physical pain. Victoria wasn't hurting her body, but from the soul-deep exhaustion of being seen as everything except what she actually was. A woman. A human being. A person trying her best in a world that had decided her worth before she ever opened her mouth. Her mother was in a hospital bed across town fighting an illness they could barely afford to treat. Her brother was 1 semester away from becoming the first person in their family to graduate college. Grace worked 12-hour days to make these things possible. She was tired. So tired. And now she stood in a billionaire's study while his mother tore her uniform and her dignity into pieces. "Do you have any idea what you're trying to destroy?" Victoria's voice dropped to something more dangerous than shouting. Something cold. "The legacy I've built? The life I've secured for him? You're nothing. You'll always be nothing. And I will not let you ruin everything I've sacrificed for." Grace's hands trembled. She pressed them together harder, fingernails digging into her own palms, using the small pain to anchor herself. She would not break. Not here. Not in front of this woman who wanted nothing more than to see her shattered. One more tear. One more rip. The fabric fell away from Grace's shoulder, exposing skin, exposing vulnerability, exposing the reality that in this moment, in this room, Grace Matthews had no power at all. "Mom." The single word dropped into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples through the fury, through the humiliation, through the violence of the moment. Victoria's hand froze mid-grip, fabric bunched in her white-knuckled fist. Grace's eyes lifted for the first time since this nightmare began. And there, filling the doorway like judgment itself, stood Marcus Worthington. His face had gone pale as death. His eyes moved slowly from his mother's twisted expression to the torn uniform hanging from Grace's trembling frame to the tears streaming down her face. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of everything changing. Of lines being crossed that could never be uncrossed. Of a moment that would alter the course of 3 lives forever. Grace couldn't look away from Marcus's face. Couldn't read what she saw there. Horror, disgust, pity, or something else entirely. Victoria remained frozen, caught in the act, her justifications dying on her lips as she met her son's eyes. And Marcus just stood there, his hands slowly curling into fists at his sides, his jaw tightening, his entire body radiating something Grace had never seen in him before. Fury. Welcome back, my lovely family, to another incredibly heartwarming story. I trust everyone is doing great. If you're new, please hit the subscribe button now, so you don't get to miss the next story. Also remember to hit the notification icon bell, so you don't miss the remaining part of this highly emotional and intriguing story. Grace Matthews had learned early in life that the world measured people in dollars and cents, in square footage and zip codes, in the weight of a last name and the shine of a car pulling into a driveway. By those measurements, she had always come up short. But her mother, God rest her weary soul still fighting in that hospital bed across town, had taught her something the world couldn't quantify. You measure a person by what they do when no one's keeping score. The apartment Grace returned to every night sat in a neighborhood where sirens were the soundtrack and hope was a luxury most couldn't afford. 347 square feet of peeling paint and temperamental plumbing on the 4th floor of a building that had seen better decades. The elevator had been broken for 2 years. Grace's legs had grown strong climbing those stairs, her arms even stronger carrying groceries for Mrs. Chen on the 5th floor who couldn't make the climb anymore. Inside that tiny space, every inch told a story. Photographs lined the narrow hallway. Frozen moments of a life built on love rather than money. Grace at 7, gap-toothed and grinning, held by her mother outside their old church. Her brother Marcus, yes, they shared the name with bitter irony, at his high school graduation, the first in their family to finish. That photo sat in a frame Grace had saved for 3 months to buy. Her mother always said education was the one thing poverty couldn't steal if you fought hard enough for it. Grace fought. She'd been fighting since she was old enough to understand that some children went to bed hungry not because there wasn't enough love, but because love couldn't pay the electric bill. She'd worked since she was 14. Under the table jobs at first, babysitting the neighborhood kids, braiding hair on weekends, anything that could add a few dollars to the envelope her mother kept hidden in the flour canister. By 16, she had working papers and a job at the grocery store. By 18, she was working 2 jobs and taking night classes at community college, dreaming of something more, something better, something that looked like the life she saw in movies and on the other side of the city. But dreams, Grace learned, had a price tag too. And when her mother collapsed at work 3 years ago, when the diagnosis came back with words like chronic and treatment and expensive, Grace made a choice. She put her dreams in a box, tucked them on the highest shelf of her tiny closet, and she did what needed to be done. The domestic service agency had seemed like a sign. The pay was better than anything she'd found before. Steady hours. Benefits after 6 months. The chance to work in homes that existed in a different universe than hers. Homes where a single room cost more to furnish than her entire year's rent. Her first assignment had been the Worthington estate. The first time Grace stood before those iron gates, her heart had hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack right through. The estate sprawled across 12 acres in the kind of neighborhood where the street names were all trees and the houses all had names instead of numbers. Worthington Manor. It sounded like something from a novel, the kind she used to read in the library when she needed to escape the smallness of her reality. The mansion itself seemed to touch the clouds. Red brick and white columns, windows that gleamed like diamonds, gardens that could swallow her entire apartment building. Grace had stood there for a full minute, her hand on the gate intercom, wondering if she'd accidentally wandered onto a movie set. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Palmer, had been kind during the interview. Firm but fair, she'd said, describing the position. The Worthington family valued discretion, professionalism, and attention to detail. Mr. Worthington, she'd explained, was a private man despite his public profile. He ran one of the largest investment firms on the East Coast, worth billions with a B that made Grace's head spin. His mother, Victoria, lived on the estate in the West Wing and was particular about how things were done. Particular. Grace would learn that was a polite word for demanding. Her first day, Grace arrived 45 minutes early. She'd taken 3 buses to get there, leaving her apartment while the sky was still dark, her uniform pressed so carefully the creases could cut paper. Mrs. Palmer had walked her through the main floor, each room larger than Grace's entire living space. The kitchen alone had 3 ovens. 3. Grace had never lived anywhere with more than one of anything. The work was exactly what it sounded like. Cleaning, maintaining, ensuring that every surface gleamed, every corner held no dust, every room looked as though humans didn't actually live there. Grace cleaned bathrooms with fixtures that cost more than a semester of the college classes she'd abandoned. She polished floors that reflected the chandeliers hanging overhead like crystal rain frozen in time. She made beds with sheets that probably had a higher thread count than her entire vocabulary. And she was invisible. That's what people with money never understood about the people who worked in their homes. They became part of the furniture, part of the walls, seen but not noticed. Grace would enter a room and the conversation wouldn't pause. She'd clean around people as they talked on phones, discussed business deals, planned vacations to places Grace couldn't pronounce. She was there, but she wasn't really there. A ghost in a uniform, moving silently through a world that existed in parallel to her own but would never intersect. She didn't mind. Invisible meant safe. Invisible meant she could do her job, collect her paycheck, and get back to what mattered. Her mother's treatments. Her brother's final year of college. The bills that never stopped coming. But invisible didn't mean blind. Grace noticed things. She noticed that Mrs. Worthington, Victoria, never smiled with her eyes. That the woman's laugh sounded rehearsed, performed, like she'd practiced it in a mirror until it sounded the way old money was supposed to sound. She noticed the way Victoria would run her finger along a shelf Grace had just cleaned, searching for dust that wasn't there, her mouth pursing in that particular way that said she was disappointed to find nothing wrong. Grace noticed the photographs throughout the house. Marcus Worthington as a child, serious even then. His small hand held by a father who appeared in the older photos but disappeared from the newer ones. Marcus at boarding school at Harvard, at various galas and events, always with that same distant look in his eyes. Like he was present but not really there. Invisible in his own way, Grace thought, even surrounded by people. She'd seen Marcus only in passing those first few weeks. A tall figure disappearing into his study. A blur in expensive suits heading out the door. Once, she'd heard him on the phone, his voice tight with frustration, talking about quarterly reports and market volatility and shareholder expectations. The language of money, a dialect Grace had never learned but recognized as the currency of stress. It was the small things that told the real story. The way his coffee mug sat untouched on his desk most mornings, gone cold by the time Grace came to clean his study in the afternoon. The way books lay open on the table beside his reading chair, multiple books, as though he started them searching for something but never found it. The way the piano in the music room sat pristine, perfect, obviously tuned regularly, but the bench, Grace noticed, had no wear on it. No one sat there. No one played. This was a house full of everything except what mattered. Grace understood that, in a way, she suspected the people who lived here never could. She'd grown up with nothing, but she'd had everything that counted. A mother who sang while cooking even when there wasn't much to cook. A brother who'd walk her home from school every day, holding her hand, telling her about his dreams of becoming a teacher. Neighbors who looked out for each other, who shared what little they had because community wasn't about wealth, It was about showing up. This house had 37 rooms, Grace had counted, and she wondered if anyone in it had ever felt less alone. Her own apartment, tiny as it was, held more life in its cramped quarters than these echoing halls. She'd come home after 12-hour shifts and find Mrs. Chen had left a container of soup outside her door. She'd climb those 4 flights of stairs and hear the Martinez family's music through the walls, salsa rhythms that made the building pulse with life. She'd collapse on her second-hand couch and video call her brother, listening to him talk about his student teaching, about the kids in his classroom, about the difference he was going to make. That was wealth. Real wealth. The kind that didn't show up in bank statements. But Grace also understood that problems looked different depending on where you stood. Just because Marcus Worthington had money didn't mean he had no problems. Loneliness didn't check your bank balance before moving in. Sadness didn't care about the thread count of your sheets. She'd been working at the estate for 2 months when something shifted. It was a Tuesday, she remembered, because Tuesdays were when she cleaned Mr. Worthington's private study. He was usually gone by the time she arrived, his schedule managed by 3 different assistants who moved through the house like efficiency machines. But that Tuesday he was still there. Grace had knocked, soft and professional, and heard a distracted come in from inside. She'd entered, cleaning supplies in hand, ready to apologize and return later. But Marcus had looked up from his desk, and for the first time, really looked at her. Not through her. At her. He'd seemed surprised to find an actual person behind the uniform. His mouth had opened as if to say something, then closed. Grace had stood there uncertain, her hand still on the door handle. Finally, he'd spoken. "The bookshelves need attention," he'd said, gesturing vaguely. "But take your time. I'm just finishing up some work." Grace had nodded, moved to the far side of the room, and begun her work. She'd been acutely aware of him there, of the scratch of his pen, the occasional sigh, the way he'd run his hand through his hair when he was thinking. She'd worked quietly, carefully, treating his books with the reverence they deserved. She'd been reaching for a volume on the top shelf when her fingers brushed the spine and she'd recognized it. The title had made her pause. She hadn't meant to say anything, but the words had slipped out, soft and wondering. "I love this book." The pen had stopped scratching. Grace had frozen, realizing her mistake. She'd overstepped. Spoken when she should have stayed silent. Existed when she should have remained invisible. But Marcus had simply asked, "You've read it?" The conversation that followed had lasted maybe 3 minutes. Brief, polite, surface level. But something in those 3 minutes had been real. 2 people talking about a story that had moved them both. Not employer and employee. Not billionaire and maid. Just 2 people who'd found something beautiful in the same pages. Grace had finished her work and left quickly, professionally, appropriately. But as she'd walked down the hallway, she'd felt something shift. A crack in the wall between their worlds. Small. Barely visible. But there. She'd told herself it meant nothing. That it was a momentary blip in the routine. That by the next day, everything would return to normal, and she'd be invisible again. She'd been wrong. Because Marcus Worthington, lonely in his castle of everything, had seen her. And once you're seen, truly seen, you can never quite become invisible again. Grace had no way of knowing that this moment, this tiny crack in the carefully constructed walls between their worlds, would eventually bring everything crashing down. She couldn't have predicted that being seen would become the most dangerous thing that ever happened to her. All she knew as she rode those 3 buses home that evening, as she climbed those 4 flights of stairs, as she heated up leftover rice and called to check on her mother's condition, was that something had changed. The world still measured people in dollars and cents. Grace still came up short by those standards. But for 3 minutes in a book-lined study, she'd been measured differently. And somewhere in a mansion across the city, A man who had everything except what mattered sat in his study, staring at a book he'd read a dozen times, wondering why a simple conversation about a story had felt more real than anything he'd experienced in years. The invisible woman had been seen, and neither of their lives would ever be the same. Marcus Worthington had been engaged 3 times before he turned 40. 3 different women, 3 different expectations, 3 different versions of what his life was supposed to look like. None of them had made it to the altar. The first had been Amanda Sinclair, daughter of a real estate mogul, someone his mother had introduced at a charity gala when he was 32. Amanda had been beautiful in that polished way that money could buy, educated at the right schools, connected to the right families. Their engagement had lasted 8 months before Marcus realized they'd never had a single conversation that mattered. They'd talked about venues and guest lists and honeymoon destinations, but never about fears or dreams or what kept them awake at 3 a.m. When he'd called it off, Amanda had seemed more upset about losing the wedding than losing him. The second had been Rebecca Chen, brilliant and ambitious, a fellow Harvard graduate who ran her own tech startup. His mother had been less enthusiastic about that one, though she'd hidden it behind thin smiles and comments about how modern everything was becoming. Rebecca and Marcus had actually connected intellectually. They'd debated economics and philosophy, challenged each other's thinking. But somewhere in the middle of building their separate empires, they'd forgotten to build anything together. The engagement had ended by mutual agreement over coffee, civilized and bloodless, like a business merger that hadn't worked out. The third had been Carolyn Ashford, and that one had hurt. Carolyn had been kind, genuinely kind, and Marcus had thought maybe this was it. Maybe he'd finally found someone who saw past the money to the person underneath. They'd been engaged for a year, the longest he'd managed. But then he'd overheard her on the phone with her sister, talking about the foundation she'd start once they were married, the social standing she'd have, the doors that would open. She'd loved what he could give her, not who he was. When he'd confronted her, she'd been confused by his anger. What did it matter, she'd asked, as long as they were happy? But they weren't happy. He wasn't happy. He'd been 23 different versions of unhappy wrapped in expensive suits and served at tables that cost more per meal than most people made in a week. After Carolyn, Marcus had stopped trying. He was 41 now, and he'd accepted that maybe some people weren't meant for the kind of love that existed in books and movies. Maybe when you had everything you couldn't have that. Maybe it was the universe's way of keeping things balanced. His days had become a rhythm of sameness. Wake at 5:30. Gym. Shower. Coffee that went cold before he drank it. Meetings that blurred together into a stream of profit margins and growth strategies and stakeholder value. More coffee. More meetings. Home to a house that felt less like a home and more like a museum he happened to sleep in. Dinner alone unless his mother insisted on one of her formal affairs, which he attended like a dutiful son, playing the role expected of him. The study had become his refuge. Late at night, after everyone else had gone to their separate corners of the massive house, Marcus would sit in his leather chair and pretend to read. Mostly, he just sat in the silence, wondering when his life had become something to endure rather than something to live. He'd built an empire. His investment firm managed portfolios worth billions. He employed over 300 people. He'd been featured in Forbes, in Bloomberg, in a dozen other publications that treated wealth like wisdom. But he couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed without it being a polite response to someone's joke at a business dinner. Couldn't remember the last time he'd felt genuinely excited about the day ahead. Then came that Tuesday. That simple question from a woman in a cleaning uniform. I love this book. Marcus had employed household staff his entire adult life. They came, they worked, they left, and he barely registered their presence. It wasn't cruelty, just the natural blindness of someone who'd grown up with people whose job was to be unnoticed. But something in Grace's voice had cut through that comfortable blindness. Something real. He'd found himself noticing her after that. The way she moved through his study with careful respect for his things. The way she'd occasionally pause at a book title, her eyes lingering before she continued her work. The way she somehow cleaned without disrupting. Present but not intrusive. More conversations followed. Brief ones, surface level, but each one felt like a small window opening in a house that had been sealed shut for too long. She'd mentioned her mother once, just in passing, and the love in her voice had been so pure it had actually hurt to hear. Marcus couldn't remember the last time he'd heard someone speak with that kind of unguarded affection. He started finding excuses to be in his study when she cleaned. Working on projects that could have been done anywhere. Taking calls that could have been taken from any room. He told himself it was nothing. Just appreciating good company. Just enjoying a few moments of genuine human interaction in a life that had become performance. But he noticed things. The way Grace never asked for anything. Never mentioned her own struggles, though he'd overheard Mrs. Palmer saying something about Grace's mother being ill. The way she treated everything in the house with care, as if each object had value beyond its price tag. The way she'd smile, a real smile that reached her eyes, when she thought no one was looking. Marcus found himself thinking about her at odd moments. During board meetings. During the expensive dinners at restaurants where the portions were artistic and tiny. During the long drives home when his car felt too big and too empty. He'd wonder what made her laugh. What she did on her days off. What dreams she'd had before life taught her to stop dreaming. He told himself this curiosity was normal. That he was simply recognizing a good employee. That his interest was professional, appropriate. Bounded by the clear lines between their positions. He was lying to himself. He knew it. But the lie was easier than the truth. Because the truth was that Grace Matthews, with her quiet dignity and genuine kindness, had become the most interesting person in his life. And that was dangerous. Victoria Worthington had not built her life on ignorance. She'd survived in the ruthless world of old money society by reading people the way others read books. She noticed everything. Every shift. Every change. Every threat. And she noticed the change in her son. It started small. Marcus lingering at breakfast instead of rushing off to the office. Marcus asking about the household staff, something he'd never done before. Marcus smiling at his phone, a soft expression she hadn't seen on his face in years. Victoria had 3 friends over for lunch when she first truly registered it. They'd been sitting in the sunroom, discussing the upcoming benefit gala, when Grace had entered with fresh tea. Victoria had been mid-sentence and hadn't really paid attention. But Eleanor Hastings had stopped talking entirely, her eyes following Grace across the room. Once Grace had left, Eleanor had leaned in conspiratorially. "Victoria, dear, your new girl is quite striking, isn't she?" The comment had landed like a pebble in still water, ripples spreading. Victoria had looked toward the door Grace had just exited through, really looked, and seen what Eleanor had seen. Grace was beautiful. Not in the cultivated way of the women in their social circle, but in a natural, effortless way that no amount of money could buy or create. Beautiful in a way that might catch a lonely man's attention. Victoria had dismissed it then. Her son had dated supermodels and heiresses. He wouldn't look twice at the help. It was absurd. But then she started watching. And what she saw made her blood run cold. She saw Marcus's face light up when Grace entered a room. Saw him find reasons to be wherever Grace was working. Saw the way they'd exchange small smiles, nothing inappropriate, nothing she could point to as evidence, but something was there. Something growing. Victoria had not raised her son to throw away everything she'd built for him on a fantasy. She'd survived her husband's death, kept the family name pristine through scandal and market crashes and social upheaval. She'd positioned Marcus perfectly. The right schools, the right connections, the right life. And she would not watch him destroy it all because some girl with a pretty face and a cleaning uniform had decided to aim above her station. The cruelty started subtly. Victoria was too smart for obvious attacks. She began with impossible standards, pointing out dust that didn't exist, demanding rooms be cleaned twice, criticizing the way Grace arranged flowers, folded linens, organized the library. Never loud, never obviously hostile, just a steady drip of disapproval designed to make Grace understand she didn't belong. Grace never complained. That made Victoria angrier. The girl just accepted the criticism, worked harder, maintained that infuriating dignity. Like she thought she was equal to them. Like she thought she had a right to be here. Victoria started scheduling Grace for the longest shifts on days when Marcus would be home, making sure the girl would be exhausted, bedraggled, a reminder of exactly what she was. Staff, help, temporary and replaceable. She'd mention other women to Marcus at dinner. Lovely Catherine Morrison is back from Paris, she'd say. Or I ran into the Hendersons today. Their daughter just made partner at that law firm. So accomplished. Subtle reminders of the women Marcus should be interested in. Women of substance, of breeding, of appropriate background. Marcus barely seemed to hear her. Victoria increased her efforts. She started having her friends over more often, making sure they'd see Grace working, making sure they'd comment, making sure the whispers would start. Because once society started talking, once the gossip mill churned, Marcus would have to face reality. He couldn't associate with the help. Not if he wanted to maintain his position. Not if he wanted to keep everything they'd built. But something was happening that Victoria hadn't anticipated. The more she pushed, the more Marcus seemed to withdraw from her. Their dinners together became tense. He'd excuse himself early. Stop confiding in her about business. Create distance where there had once been closeness. Victoria told herself it was temporary. That Marcus was going through something, a midlife crisis perhaps, and he'd come to his senses. Men did this sometimes. They got confused. They mistook kindness for something more. They had their little fantasies. But they always came back to reality eventually. She just needed to accelerate the process. Victoria began leaving little comments within Grace's hearing. Observations about how certain people needed to remember their place. Stories about other household staff who'd gotten too comfortable and had to be let go. Nothing direct. Nothing Grace could report or complain about. Just seeds of anxiety. Planted carefully, watered with subtle menace. Grace's hands had started shaking slightly when Victoria entered a room. Victoria noticed. Good. Fear was useful. Fear kept people in their lanes. But what Victoria didn't see, because she was so focused on Grace, was that Marcus was watching too. Watching his mother's sudden interest in household management. Watching the way Grace's shoulders would tense when Victoria appeared. Watching the small cruelties disguised as standards. Marcus wasn't stupid. He'd grown up watching his mother operate. He knew her tactics. He knew her manipulations. He'd benefited from them often enough when they were directed at business competitors or social rivals. But seeing them directed at Grace, seeing his mother try to diminish someone whose only crime was existing in the wrong tax bracket, something in him had shifted. He'd started finding ways to counteract his mother's demands, telling Mrs. Palmer that Grace's work was excellent and she shouldn't be required to redo perfectly acceptable tasks, leaving generous tips in places Grace would find them, and signed but intentional, making sure Grace's schedule included reasonable breaks and days off. It was a quiet war, fought in glances and scheduling changes and household policies. Mother and son circling each other, neither willing to address what they were really fighting about. Because to address it would be to acknowledge it. And to acknowledge it would mean admitting that something impossible was happening. Marcus Worthington, who'd had every advantage, every opportunity, every woman his mother or society could parade in front of him, was falling for someone he absolutely should not fall for. Someone whose presence in his life violated every unspoken rule of his world. Someone who represented everything his life wasn't supposed to include. Grace Matthews, who cleaned his floors and made his bed and existed on the periphery of his privilege, had somehow become the center of something he couldn't name and couldn't stop. And Victoria Worthington, who'd spent her entire life building and protecting and maintaining the fortress of their family's position, could feel it crumbling. Could feel her son slipping away from her carefully laid plans. Could feel the threat of something she couldn't control growing stronger every day. The worst part, the part that kept Victoria awake at night in her perfectly appointed bedroom, was that she couldn't even articulate what was happening. Nothing inappropriate had occurred. No lines had been crossed. No rules had been broken. But something had changed. And change, in Victoria's world, was just another word for danger. She'd tried reasoning with herself. Grace would move on eventually. People like her always did. They'd find another job, another opportunity, another place to be. This was temporary. Marcus would forget her. Life would return to normal. But deep down, in a place Victoria refused to examine too closely, she knew this wasn't temporary. Knew that whatever was building between her son and the girl in the uniform was the kind of thing that either burned out quickly or burned everything down. Victoria had not spent 63 years building her life, her position, her family's legacy, to watch it burn. So she made a decision. She would end this. Quickly. Decisively. Before it became something that couldn't be undone. She just needed the right moment. The right circumstances. The right amount of pressure applied to the right weak point. And then one afternoon, as Victoria watched from her window, she saw Marcus and Grace in the garden. Nothing inappropriate. They were 20 feet apart. Marcus was on a phone call. Grace was emptying the birdbath. But the way Marcus glanced over at her, the small smile that crossed his face when he thought no one was watching, the way Grace looked up and smiled back before quickly returning to her work, it was in that moment Victoria knew. Her son was in love. Or falling into it. Or close enough that the distinction didn't matter. And the object of his affection was completely, utterly, impossibly wrong. Victoria felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. She'd been patient. She'd been subtle. She'd tried the gentle approach. But gentleness, she decided, wasn't working. It was time for something more direct. Time to remind everyone involved exactly who held the power in this house. Time to put the fear of God, or at least the fear of Victoria Worthington, into a girl who'd forgotten her place. Time to end this before it truly began. The storm was coming. And Grace Matthews, with her quiet dignity and her inappropriate effect on Victoria's son, had no idea she was standing directly in its path. The annual Worthington Foundation Charity Gala was the kind of event that made the society pages and raised enough money to fund 3 hospitals. It was also the kind of event that required 2 weeks of preparation, an army of additional staff, and the transformation of the estate into something even more impressive than it already was. Grace had worked 12-hour days for the past week helping prepare. Crystal chandeliers that already sparkled were taken down, cleaned piece by piece, and rehung. Silver that already gleamed was polished until you could see your soul in it. Flowers were arranged and rearranged until they looked effortlessly perfect, which was ironic because nothing about perfection was effortless. The day of the gala arrived with the kind of sunshine that seemed ordered specifically for wealthy people's outdoor events. Grace had been at the estate since dawn, part of the team making final preparations. Her uniform was crisp and fresh, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, her shoes polished to a shine that rivaled the silverware. Victoria had been a hurricane of demands all morning. The centerpieces needed to be adjusted. The champagne glasses repositioned. The hors d'oeuvres trays checked and rechecked. Grace had learned to simply nod and execute, to not take the sharp comments personally, to understand that Victoria's perfectionism came from a place of deep insecurity masquerading as high standards. By early afternoon, guests began arriving. The kind of people who made the world turn with their decisions and donations. CEOs and politicians, old money and new, all dressed in clothes that cost more than Grace's annual salary. All wearing smiles that had been practiced in mirrors and at networking events. Grace moved through the crowd like a ghost, offering champagne, clearing empty glasses, ensuring everything ran smoothly. She'd perfected the art of being present but invisible, helpful but unnoticed. It was a skill that served her well at events like these. But something was different today. People kept looking at her. Not through her the way they usually did. At her. An older gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes took a champagne flute from her tray and said, "Thank you, my dear. You have excellent posture. My daughter should take lessons." He'd said it warmly as a compliment, and Grace had smiled politely and moved on. A woman in a dress that probably cost what Grace made in 6 months had stopped her to ask about the hors d'oeuvres. As Grace explained the menu, the woman had studied her face and said, "You're quite articulate. Where did you study?" The question had been innocent enough, but it carried the weight of surprise. Surprise that someone in a service uniform could speak clearly and intelligently. Grace had answered graciously, "Community college, ma'am. Evening classes." The woman had nodded, seeming impressed, and Grace had continued her rounds. But Victoria had been watching. Victoria saw every interaction. Saw her guests noticing the help. Saw them treating Grace like a person rather than a piece of mobile furniture. And with each interaction, Victoria's jaw had tightened a fraction more. The final straw came when Eleanor Hastings, the same woman who'd commented on Grace's looks weeks earlier, pulled Victoria aside near the rose garden. "Victoria," she'd said, voice low but excited, "you simply must tell me where you found that gorgeous girl serving champagne. My daughter is getting married next spring and I need staff with that kind of presence. She's absolutely stunning and so poised." Victoria had smiled, the kind of smile that could cut glass. "She's just temporary help, Eleanor. I'm sure she'll be moving on soon." But Eleanor had persisted. "Well, before she moves on, do share her information. You know how hard it is to find good people these days. People with grace." She'd laughed at her own accidental pun, not knowing it was the girl's actual name. Victoria had excused herself quickly. Her champagne glass gripped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She'd moved through her own party like a woman on a mission, her eyes scanning the crowd until she found what she was looking for. Grace, carrying an empty tray back toward the kitchen. Victoria had intercepted her path. "The girl," she'd said, her voice sharp enough to stop Grace mid-step. "A word. My study." No. Grace had set down her tray carefully, her heart already beginning to race. She'd followed Victoria through the house, away from the party, away from the safety of witnesses. They'd walked in silence, Victoria's heels clicking against marble like a countdown. The study. Marcus's private study. The room where Grace had first spoken to him about books and stories. The room where she'd felt seen for the first time in this house. Victoria led her inside and closed the door with a click that sounded like a lock, though it wasn't. Grace stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting. She'd learned that waiting silently was often the safest choice. Let the storm pass. Let the criticism come. Accept it. Move forward. Survive. But Victoria didn't speak immediately. She circled Grace like a predator assessing prey. Her eyes took in every detail of Grace's appearance, searching for something to criticize, some flaw to exploit. "You think you're clever," Victoria finally said. Her voice was low, controlled, but trembling with something darker underneath. "You think I don't see what you're doing?" Grace's forehead creased slightly. "I'm not sure I understand, Mrs. Worthington." Victoria's laugh was hollow. "Don't play innocent with me. Parading around my party, catching everyone's attention, making yourself noticed. You think if enough of my friends compliment you, if enough people see you, that somehow you'll become something you're not?" Grace felt her stomach drop. She'd done nothing wrong. She'd simply done her job. But Victoria's accusations weren't about what Grace had done. They were about what Victoria feared Grace might become. "Mrs. Worthington," Grace said carefully, "I was only serving drinks. I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to what?" Victoria stepped closer, her face inches from Grace's. "Didn't mean to smile at my guests? Didn't mean to engage them in conversation? Didn't mean to make them think you're anything other than what you are?" The words hit like slaps. Grace felt her breath catch but forced herself to remain calm. "I apologize if I overstepped. It won't happen again." "You're right, it won't." Victoria's eyes had taken on a wild quality, something unhinged that Grace had never seen before. "Because you need to understand something. This," Victoria gestured around the study, "this house, this life, my son, none of it is for you. None of it will ever be for you." Grace's hands trembled. She clasped them tighter together. "I've never suggested. Don't lie to me." Victoria's voice rose. "I've watched you. I've seen the way you look at him, the way you linger, the way you've wormed your way into his routine. You think I don't know what you're doing? You think I'm stupid?" Grace's own voice emerged smaller than she intended. "I clean his study because it's my job, Mrs. Worthington. I've never—" "Your job." Victoria spat the words. "Your job is to be invisible. Your job is to clean and leave and not even register as a memory in anyone's mind. But you couldn't do that, could you? You had to make yourself seen. You had to catch his attention." Grace felt tears building behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. "I've done nothing wrong. You exist wrong." The words landed like a physical blow. "You exist in spaces where you don't belong. You exist in my son's attention. You exist as a fantasy that will ruin his life if I don't stop it now." Victoria moved faster than Grace expected. Her hands shot out and grabbed the collar of Grace's uniform. Grace gasped, stepping back, but Victoria held firm. "You need to understand," Victoria said through gritted teeth, "exactly what you are." The first tear was small. The sound of fabric beginning to separate. Grace's eyes widened, her hands coming up instinctively but not fighting back. She couldn't fight back. Couldn't defend herself. Couldn't do anything but stand there as Victoria Worthington, woman of wealth and privilege and power, tore at her uniform like it was the source of all her problems. "Mrs. Worthington, please," Grace's voice cracked. But Victoria was beyond hearing, beyond reason, consumed by fear and rage and the terrifying feeling of losing control. The fabric tore further. Then more. The sound echoed in the book-lined room, obscene in its violence. Grace felt something warm on her cheek. A tear. Then another. Not from the physical act, Victoria wasn't hurting her body, but from the humiliation. From the cruelty. From the reminder that no matter how hard she worked, how kind she was, how much dignity she maintained, There would always be people who saw her as less than human. You think you can seduce your way out of poverty? Victoria was saying, her face twisted with disgust. You think I don't see what you're doing? Trap my son with whatever this is? Her hand gestured at Grace, at her face, her presence, her very existence. You clean toilets, Victoria continued, the words coming faster now, each one designed to cut deeper. You scrub floors. And you will not trap my son with whatever this is. The fabric hung in tatters now. Grace's shoulder was exposed. She felt cold air on her skin. Felt exposed in every possible way. But she didn't move. Didn't run. Didn't give Victoria the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken. She just stood there, tears sliding down her cheeks, and breathed. In and out. In and out. The way her mother had taught her. The way she'd survived every other moment when the world had tried to tell her she didn't matter. Mrs. Worthington, Grace tried one more time, her voice barely a whisper. Don't. Victoria pulled again, another rip. Don't you dare speak to me like you're my equal. The door opened. One word. Just one word. But it fell into the room like a bomb. Mom. Victoria's hand froze mid-grip. Grace's eyes lifted for the first time since the assault began. And there, standing in the doorway of his own study, stood Marcus Worthington. His face was pale. His eyes moved from his mother's twisted expression to the torn fabric in her hands to Grace's tear-stained face. The silence that followed felt like it lasted hours, though it was probably only seconds. Victoria's hand slowly released the fabric. She stepped back, seeming to realize for the first time what she'd done. But her face didn't show remorse. It showed defiance. Justification. The look of someone who believed the ends justified any means. Marcus, Victoria began, her voice attempting to regain composure, this girl. But Marcus wasn't looking at his mother anymore. His eyes were fixed on Grace. On her tears. On her trembling hands. On the uniform that had been pristine hours ago and now hung in ruins. Grace, he said softly. Are you okay? It was the gentleness in his voice that finally broke her. Not Victoria's cruelty. Not the torn uniform. Not the humiliation. But the simple, human question asked with genuine concern. Are you okay? Grace opened her mouth but no words came out. She wasn't okay. She was standing in torn clothing in a billionaire's study after being physically and verbally assaulted by his mother. She wasn't okay. She would probably never work in this house again. Would probably be blamed for whatever story Victoria told. Would probably lose the best-paying job she'd ever had right when her mother needed expensive treatments and her brother needed help with final semester expenses. She wasn't okay. But she nodded anyway. Because what else could she do? Marcus's jaw tightened. He looked at his mother then, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. Something cold and hard and final. Get out, he said quietly. Victoria's eyes widened. Excuse me. I said get out. Marcus's voice was still quiet, but there was steel underneath. Out of my study. No. Victoria drew herself up to her full height. This is my house too, Marcus. And someone needs to protect you from. From what? Marcus's voice rose for the first time. From kindness. From decency. From someone who actually sees me as a human being instead of a portfolio to manage. The accusation hung in the air. Victoria's mouth opened, closed, opened again. She looked between her son and Grace, seeming to realize she'd miscalculated. That this wasn't going the way she'd planned. We'll discuss this later, Victoria said, attempting to reclaim authority. When you've calmed down and can see reason. She moved toward the door, expecting Marcus to step aside. He didn't. They stood face to face for a long moment, mother and son, a lifetime of manipulation and control and expectation crackling between them. Finally, Victoria swept past him into the hallway. Her footsteps echoed away, back toward the party, back to the world where she was in control and everything made sense according to the rules she'd spent a lifetime enforcing. The door clicked shut. Marcus and Grace stood in the study, the silence somehow louder than the confrontation had been. Outside, the party continued. Laughter drifted through the windows. Champagne glasses clinked. The world moved on, unaware that in this book-lined room, everything had just changed. Marcus took a careful step toward Grace. His hands raised slightly as if approaching someone who might bolt. "I'm so sorry," he said. His voice cracked on the words. "I'm so sorry." Grace finally moved. Her hands came up to her torn uniform, trying uselessly to hold the fabric together. She felt naked despite being mostly covered. Felt exposed in ways that had nothing to do with skin. "I should go," she said. I should." "Wait." Marcus moved to his desk, grabbed his suit jacket from the back of his chair, and held it out to her. "Please, take this." Grace stared at the expensive jacket like it might bite her. "I can't." "Please," Marcus said again. His eyes were desperate. "Please let me do something. Anything." Slowly, Grace reached out and took the jacket. It was heavy, well-made, probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. She slipped it on over her torn uniform. It swallowed her, hung to her knees, but it covered the damage, covered the evidence of her humiliation. "Thank you," she whispered. They stood there, two people from completely different worlds, and for the first time since that Tuesday conversation about books, the distance between them felt impossible to cross, because it wasn't just about money or position anymore. It was about the very real consequences of crossing lines that society had drawn in permanent ink. Marcus wanted to say more. Grace could see it in his face. But what was there to say? "I'm sorry my mother assaulted you. I'm sorry you exist in a world that treats you like this. I'm sorry I noticed you at all and made you a target. I need to go home," Grace said finally. The words came out steadier than she felt. "I'll have a car," Marcus started. "No." Grace shook her head. "No, please. I need to go." She moved toward the door, wrapped in his jacket, her torn uniform hidden underneath. Marcus didn't try to stop her. What could he do? Fire his own mother? Erase what had happened? Fix a system that had been broken long before either of them was born? "Grace," he said as her hand touched the doorknob. She paused but didn't turn around. "This isn't over. I won't let this be over." Grace didn't respond. She opened the door and walked out into the hallway, past the sounds of the party, past the world that had no place for someone like her wearing someone else's jacket over her ruins. She walked out of the mansion, past the gardens, past the gates, onto the street where she'd wait for the bus because she'd sent the car service away hours ago. She'd sit at the bus stop wrapped in a Billionaire'S jacket, and she'd cry. Not because Victoria had torn her uniform. Fabric could be replaced. Not even because she'd been humiliated. Pride could be rebuilt. She'd cry because for a brief, impossible moment, she'd let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could exist in Marcus Worthington's world without becoming a casualty of it. She'd been wrong. And now, standing at that bus stop as the sun set over a city that had never been hers, Grace Matthews understood a fundamental truth. Love didn't conquer all. Sometimes love just made you a target. Sometimes being seen was the most dangerous thing that could happen to you. Sometimes the best thing you could do was disappear. If you're still watching this story, if Grace's dignity in the face of cruelty has touched something in you, if you've ever felt invisible in a world that only sees value in certain kinds of people, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button. Not for me, but because stories like this need to be told. Because Grace's experience isn't fiction for everyone. Because sometimes the algorithm decides which voices matter. And your subscription says this one does. Let's make sure stories about courage and dignity and the complicated truth about class and race and love actually reach the people who need to hear them. Back in the mansion, Marcus Worthington stood alone in his study, staring at the torn pieces of white fabric his mother had left on the floor. He picked them up slowly, carefully, like they were evidence, like they mattered. And something in him, something that had been asleep or suppressed or carefully managed for 41 years, woke up. He'd spent his whole life being what other people needed him to be. The dutiful son. The successful businessman. The appropriate partner. The right kind of wealthy. He'd played every role perfectly, followed every rule, stayed inside every line. And where had it gotten him? Standing alone in a study full of books he barely read, in a house that felt like a mausoleum, having just watched his mother assault someone whose only crime was being kind to him. Marcus looked at the fabric in his hands. White cotton, industrial strength, designed to last. The uniform of someone who worked for a living. The uniform of someone who'd probably never be able to afford the jacket he'd given her to cover her shame. And he made a decision. Not a careful one. Not a measured one. Not one that his board would approve or his mother would understand or society would accept. A human one. Whatever happened next, whatever it cost him, whatever bridges burned or empires crumbled, he was done being the person everyone else needed him to be. It was time to be the person Grace Matthews had seen in him. The person who existed underneath the portfolio and the position and the privilege. It was time to choose. The question was, would that choice destroy them both? Or would it be the first real thing he'd done in his entire carefully constructed life? Outside, the party continued. Inside, everything had already ended. But those boundaries felt meaningless now. What was appropriate about what had happened today? What line mattered more than making sure Grace was okay? His finger hovered over her contact, then stopped. What would he say? I'm sorry my mother assaulted you? I'm sorry my world is built on the suffering of people like you? I'm sorry I didn't stop this before it started? He set the phone down. Some conversations couldn't happen over text. Some debts couldn't be paid with words. Morning came without Marcus having slept. He showered, dressed in casual clothes rather than a suit, and made a decision. He needed to see Grace. Needed to know she was okay. Needed to say the things that had kept him awake all night. Mrs. Palmer had Grace's address in the employee files. Marcus had never looked at it before. Had never needed to know where his staff lived when they weren't serving his needs. The guilt of that ignorance sat heavy in his chest as he drove across the city, watching the neighborhoods change from manicured lawns to cracked sidewalks, from pristine storefronts to buildings that needed repairs no one could afford. Grace's building was exactly what he'd expected and somehow worse for being real. For stories of tired brick and windows that didn't quite fit their frames. The front door's lock was broken, buzzer system dead. Marcus walked up 4 flights of stairs that smelled like old cooking and mildew and lives lived without cushions. He knocked on apartment 4C. Soft at first, then louder when there was no response. Finally, the door opened a crack, chains still attached, and Grace's face appeared in the gap. Her eyes widened when she saw him. She opened the door fully, and Marcus saw she was still in pajamas, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face free of makeup. She looked younger, more vulnerable, more beautiful than she ever had in her uniform. Mr. Worthington, she said, her voice confused and worried. Is everything did something? Can I come in? Marcus asked. Please. Grace hesitated. her eyes flicking to the tiny space behind her. The apartment was probably the size of his walk-in closet. But she stepped aside, let him enter, closed the door behind him. Marcus stood in the center of Grace's life and felt the full weight of the distance between their worlds. The apartment wasn't dirty or neglected. It was clean, organized, obviously cared for. But it was small. So impossibly small. And everywhere he looked, he saw evidence of choices made by necessity rather than preference. Medical bills stacked neatly on a small table. Photographs in frames that had been carefully selected for meaning rather than matching the decor. A couch that was clean but worn, loved but old. A kitchen barely big enough for one person. This was what Grace came home to every night after cleaning rooms larger than her entire apartment. "I wanted to check on you," Marcus said, turning to face her. "To make sure you were okay. To apologize for—" "You don't need to apologize for your mother," Grace interrupted softly. "You didn't do anything wrong. I didn't stop it." Marcus's voice was rough. "I should have seen it coming. Should have protected you from—" "Huh?" Grace's question was gentle but pointed. "You can't control what other people do, Mr. Worthington. Even people you love." The words sat between them. Even people you love. Yes. He loved his mother. That made her cruelty harder, not easier. Made his choice more complicated, not simpler. "I'm not coming back," Grace said suddenly. "To the estate. I can't work there anymore." Marcus had expected this. Had prepared for it. "I understand. But I want to make sure you're taken care of. Let me help with—" "No." Grace shook her head firmly. "No money. Please. I appreciate the offer, but I can't, it wouldn't be right." There was that dignity again. That pride that wouldn't accept charity even when she desperately needed it. Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to insist, but he understood. Taking his money would change the nature of whatever existed between them. Would make it a transaction. Would taint something that felt pure. "Then let me write you a reference," Marcus tried. "The best reference anyone has ever received. You'll have another job in days. Something better. Something where you'll be treated with the respect you deserve." Grace's eyes filled with tears she wouldn't let fall. "Thank you. That I can accept." They stood in her tiny living room, and Marcus knew he needed to leave. Knew he'd already overstayed, already pushed the boundaries of appropriate. But leaving felt impossible. Standing in her space, seeing her life, understanding the weight she carried every day, it had changed something fundamental in how he saw the world. "Grace," he said softly, "what my mother said to you. None of it was true. You know that, right?" Grace smiled sadly. "Some of it was true. I do clean toilets. I do scrub floors. Those are facts, not insults. Your mother just thinks they should be. That's not what I mean." Marcus took a step closer, then stopped himself. "I mean the other things. About you trying to trap me or seduce me, or whatever paranoid fantasy she'd built in her head. You've never been anything but professional. Anything but kind. And I—" He stopped. Because what came next was a line he couldn't uncross. An admission that would change everything. "You should go," Grace said quietly, saving him from himself. "But thank you for coming. Thank you for caring enough to check on me. That means more than you know." Marcus nodded. Left his card on her table. "If you need anything. Anything at all. Please." Then he left, walking back down those 4 flights of stairs, getting into his car that cost more than most people's houses, and driving back across the city to his estate that suddenly felt more like a prison than a home. The confrontation with his mother came that evening. Marcus had spent the day in his study, not working, just thinking. About grace. About the choices that had led to yesterday. About the future he'd always assumed he'd have and the future he actually wanted. Victoria swept into his study without knocking, which was typical. Her face was composed, her outfit perfect, every hair in place. Like yesterday hadn't happened. Like she hadn't assaulted an employee in this very room less than 24 hours ago. "We need to discuss the situation," Victoria began, settling into the chair across from his desk like this was a board meeting. "What situation would that be?" Marcus's voice was cold. "Don't be obtuse, Marcus. It doesn't suit you. The girl. I handled it. She won't be returning. And I think it's best we don't provide a reference. Clean break. No connections that could come back to haunt us." Something in Marcus's chest tightened. "Us. There is no us in this, Mother. You assaulted an employee. You tore her clothing. You humiliated her. And now you want to punish her further by damaging her employment prospects?" Victoria's eyes narrowed. "I protected this family from a potential scandal. From a gold digger who—" "Stop." Marcus's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Grace is not a gold digger. She's never asked me for anything. Never hinted at wanting anything. She's been nothing but professional and kind and decent. Things that, frankly, are in short supply in our world." "Our world." Victoria stood, her composure cracking. "Yes, Marcus. Our world. The world I've spent my entire life building and maintaining. The world that gave you every advantage. The world you seem ready to throw away for, what? A pretty face? A fantasy. She's not a fantasy." Marcus stood too, facing his mother across the desk. "She's a real person. With a real life. And real dignity that you tried to strip away because you were afraid." "Afraid?" Victoria's laugh was sharp. "Of what exactly?" "That I'm falling in love with her." The words dropped into the room like a grenade. Marcus hadn't meant to say them. Hadn't even admitted them to himself until they were already out, already real, already impossible to take back. Victoria's face went pale, then red, then pale again. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." What followed was a battle fought with the weapons of family. Victoria deployed every tactic she'd perfected over a lifetime. Guilt about his father's memory. Threats about the family reputation. Manipulation about her health and her age and how much longer she'd be around. Promises about introducing him to appropriate women. Warnings about gold diggers and scandals and what society would say. She painted pictures of ruin. Of business partners withdrawing. Of social circles closing. Of the Worthington name becoming a joke. Of Marcus throwing away everything for a woman who couldn't possibly understand his world, who would be miserable in it, who would eventually resent him for pulling her into a life she wasn't prepared for. And then came the ultimatum. Her or your family legacy. Her or everything we've built. Her or me. Marcus let her speak. Let her exhaust every argument. Let her believe she was winning. And when she finally fell silent, waiting for him to capitulate the way he always had, he said one word. Her. Victoria staggered as if he'd struck her. "You don't mean that." "I mean it more than I've meant anything." Marcus felt a strange calm settling over him. A clarity he'd never experienced. "I'm done living the life you designed for me, Mother. I'm done with appropriate partners and suitable matches and maintaining appearances. I'm done being lonely in a house full of everything except what matters. If you do this," Victoria's voice shook, "if you pursue this fantasy, you'll regret it. Society will." "Society," Marcus interrupted, "is made up of people like you. People who measure worth by bank accounts and bloodlines. And I'm tired of letting those people dictate my life. I'm 41 years old. I've built my own empire. And I'll decide who I spend my life with. She'll never fit in. Victoria tried one last time. She'll be miserable. You'll both be miserable. Maybe, Marcus acknowledged. Or maybe we'll build something real. Something that actually matters. Either way, it'll be my choice. Not yours. Victoria stood frozen, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Finally, she walked to the door, paused with her hand on the frame, and delivered her final shot. When this falls apart, when she leaves you or you realize your mistake, don't come crying to me. I won't say I told you so, but I won't help you pick up the pieces either. Then she was gone. Marcus sat back down at his desk and stared at nothing. He'd just chosen Grace over everything he'd ever known. Over his mother. Over his social standing. Over the comfortable predictability of his life. And the terrifying part was that Grace hadn't chosen him back. Didn't even know he was making this choice. Might not want him to make it. He spent the next 3 days researching. Not Grace, that felt invasive, but the systems that had shaped her life. He read about poverty wages and medical debt, about community colleges and evening classes and the math that didn't add up for people who started behind the line everyone else called start. He read about systemic racism and microaggressions and all the ways society told certain people they didn't belong in certain spaces. He looked into Grace's family. Found her brother's teaching credentials, bright and promising. Found her mother's hospital records. Public information that showed mounting bills and serious illness. Found scholarships and loans and the paper trail of a family fighting to climb a ladder that others rode an elevator past. Grace had been supporting all of it. Working full-time, taking care of her mother. Helping her brother finish school. And she'd done it without complaint. Without asking for help. Without using the access she had to a billionaire's home to try to leverage anything for herself. She was, Marcus realized, the strongest person he'd ever met. Stronger than any CEO he'd negotiated with. Stronger than his mother with all her manipulation. Stronger than Marcus himself, who'd never had to fight for anything because everything had been handed to him. And that strength, that dignity, that quiet courage, that's what he'd fallen in love with. Not her beauty, though she was beautiful. Not some fantasy of rescuing someone, though his mother's accusations echoed. But the person she was. The way she moved through the world with grace despite the world giving her every reason not to. Marcus had spent his life around people who performed strength, performed confidence, performed success. Grace didn't perform anything. She just was. And he wanted to know who he could be if he was just himself too. Not Marcus Worthington. Billionaire. Not the dutiful son or the successful businessman or the appropriate bachelor. Just Marcus. Flawed and lonely and searching for something real. Grace represented that possibility. But more than that, she deserved someone who would stand beside her. Who would fight for her the way she'd fought for everyone else her entire life. Who would see her value not despite her circumstances but because of everything she'd overcome. Now, if you've made it this far in Grace and Marcus's story, I need to ask you something. Have you ever felt like you had to choose between what your family wanted and what your heart needed? Have you ever watched someone show more courage in their everyday life than you've shown in your entire existence? Drop your location and your thoughts in the comments. Let's build a community of people who understand that real wealth isn't measured in dollars. And if this story is speaking to you, if you want to see how this impossible situation resolves, subscribe. Because we're about to reach the moment where Marcus makes a choice that will shock everyone, including himself. Marcus made his decision on the 4th day. He called in every favor he owed. Spoke to lawyers and accountants and board members. made arrangements that would protect Grace no matter what happened next, set up funds that couldn't be traced back to him, routed through the foundation, specifically for families dealing with medical debt. Grace's mother would be covered. Her brother's loans would be paid. They'd never know it came from him. That was love too. The kind that gave without taking credit. The kind that helped without strings. The kind that existed whether or not it was returned. But he wanted more than to help from the shadows. He wanted to stand in the light beside her. Wanted to face whatever came together. Wanted to build something real with the only person who'd ever made him feel like he was more than his bank balance. He just needed to ask. And accept whatever answer she gave. Even if that answer was no. Even if that answer was it's too complicated. Even if that answer broke his heart. Because Grace Matthews deserved the choice. Deserved to decide her own life. Deserved someone who would give her that power rather than taking it away. Marcus looked at his phone. At her contact. At the line he was about to cross. And he pressed dial. Grace stared at her phone when Marcus's name appeared on the screen. Her finger hovered over the decline button. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to let this impossible situation fade into memory, to go back to being invisible in a world that didn't see her anyway. But another part of her, the part that had felt truly seen for the first time in that book-lined study weeks ago, couldn't let it ring unanswered. She picked up, said hello in a voice that shook despite her best efforts. Marcus asked if they could meet. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere they could talk without the weight of his estate or the smallness of her apartment pressing down on them. Grace agreed before her logical mind could stop her heart from speaking. They met in a park the next afternoon. One of those public spaces where the city tried to pretend nature still existed between concrete and steel. Marcus was already there when Grace arrived, sitting on a bench overlooking a small pond where ducks argued over breadcrumbs thrown by children who didn't understand they weren't supposed to feed the wildlife. He stood when he saw her. Grace noticed he looked different, tired, like he hadn't been sleeping, but also somehow lighter, like he'd put down something heavy he'd been carrying for years. They sat, not too close, maintaining that careful distance that acknowledged the impossibility of their situation. And Marcus spoke. He told her everything. About the confrontation with his mother. About the ultimatum. About his choice. He told her about the research he'd done, not into her personally, but into the world she navigated every day. He told her he'd set up funding through the foundation, anonymous, to help families like hers. Not because of her, he clarified, but because of what knowing her had taught him about how broken the system was. And then he told her the truth. That he was falling in love with her. That he had been for weeks. That every conversation, every moment, every time she'd smiled when she thought no one was watching, it had all added up to something he couldn't ignore anymore. Grace sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, tears streaming down her face. Not from sadness. From the overwhelming weight of hearing someone say the words she'd been terrified to even think. Because she'd been falling too. Had tried so hard not to. Had told herself it was impossible, inappropriate, dangerous. Had reminded herself every single day that Marcus Worthington lived in a different universe and she was just passing through his orbit temporarily. Had fought against every flutter in her chest when he walked into a room, every quickening of her pulse when their eyes met, every moment of hoping for something that could never be. But hearts don't listen to logic. Hearts don't care about tax brackets or social hierarchies or all the very good reasons something shouldn't happen. Hearts just feel what they feel and hope against hope that maybe, just maybe, the feeling is mutual. Grace told him her truth too. About how scared she'd been of these feelings. About how she'd known from the beginning that this could only end in pain. About how loving him felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. knowing the fall would destroy her but unable to step back from the edge. She told him about the day his mother had torn her uniform. Not just what happened, but how it felt. Like being reminded that no matter how much dignity she maintained, no matter how hard she worked, no matter who she was inside, there would always be people who saw her as less than, as a threat to be neutralized, as something to be removed. And she told him why she couldn't do this, couldn't be with him. Not because she didn't love him, she did. God help her, she did. But because the cost was too high. For him. For his relationship with his mother. For his business. For his entire life. She couldn't be the reason he lost everything. Couldn't live with that weight. Couldn't watch him resent her eventually when the reality of what he'd given up for her became too heavy to carry. Marcus listened. Let her speak. Let her give all her very valid reasons why this couldn't work. And when she finished, when the silence stretched between them like an ocean, he asked her one question. What if I don't care about any of that? What if everything I'd be giving up is exactly what's been making me miserable? The question hung in the air. Grace had no answer for it. Because she'd spent her entire life believing that people with everything had no right to be unhappy. That wealth solved all problems. That privilege was a shield against pain. But looking at Marcus, really looking at him, she saw the truth. He'd been drowning in his everything. Suffocating under the weight of expectations and appearances and a life built by someone else's blueprint. They sat in that park for 3 hours. Talking through every obstacle, every potential problem, every reason this was a terrible idea and every reason it might be the only idea that made sense. They didn't solve anything, didn't come to any grand conclusions, but they acknowledged the truth between them, that something real existed, something worth fighting for, something that might destroy them both or might save them. Either way, it existed, and pretending it wouldn't make it go away. When they finally parted, Grace walked home with Marcus's promise echoing in her head. I'm not giving up on this. On us. I need you to know that. Whatever comes next, I'm not giving up. Grace didn't know if that promise was beautiful or terrifying. Probably both. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange limbo. Grace found new work quickly. Marcus's reference had been so glowing it opened doors she'd never dreamed existed. She was hired by a family who treated her with respect, paid her well, and didn't make her feel invisible. It should have been perfect. But she found herself thinking about Marcus constantly, wondering if he was okay, if his mother had forgiven him, if he'd come to his senses and realized Grace had been right about all of it. She didn't expect what came next. Marcus called a board meeting. Not unusual, he did this quarterly. But this time, he'd invited more than just board members. He'd invited his mother, the senior partners at his firm, several prominent investors, people whose opinions shaped the business world, people whose approval or disapproval could make or break deals worth billions. The conference room at Worthington Investments was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A table that sat 30 people comfortably. Art on the walls worth more than small countries' GDP. This was where empires were built and destroyed. Where fortunes changed hands. Where power lived. Victoria sat at one end of the table, composed and confident. She'd spent the last 2 weeks convincing herself that Marcus's moment of insanity had passed, that he'd realized his mistake, that things would return to normal and they'd never speak of the help again. She was wrong. Marcus stood at the head of the table and made an announcement that would echo through their social circles for years. He wasn't just stepping down from certain responsibilities. He wasn't just restructuring the company. He was restructuring his entire life. He spoke about authenticity, about living according to values rather than expectations, about the difference between wealth and richness, about being alone in crowds of people who should have mattered but didn't, about finding connection in unexpected places, about choosing love over legacy. And then he told them about Grace. Not her name, not at first, but about a woman who'd taught him more about dignity and strength in a few months than he'd learned in 41 years of privilege. About someone who'd never asked him for anything but had given him everything that mattered. About falling in love with someone completely wrong according to every rule he'd ever been taught, and realizing that maybe the rules were the problem. He announced his intention to marry her, to the shock of everyone in that room, to the horror on his mother's face, to the gasps and whispers and the immediate mental calculations of what this would mean for business, for society, for the carefully maintained order of their world. Marcus didn't ask permission, didn't seek approval, simply stated his truth and let it land where it would. He acknowledged it would cause problems, that some people would distance themselves, that there would be gossip and judgment and 1,000 opinions about his choices. He accepted all of that as the price of being himself. Victoria stood, her face pale, her hands trembling. "This is madness," she said. "You'll ruin everything." Marcus looked at his mother with something that might have been pity. "No, Mom. I'm finally building something. Everything else was just expensive emptiness." The meeting ended in chaos. Some board members supportive, others concerned, a few openly hostile. But Marcus had made his choice public, had put his truth out into the world where it couldn't be taken back, had burned the bridges his mother had spent a lifetime building. Now he just needed to ask Grace if she'd walk across the ashes with him. He went to her apartment that evening, knocked on the door with a ring in his pocket and a question on his lips. Grace opened the door, saw his face, and knew immediately that something had changed. Marcus told her about the meeting, about his announcement, about choosing her in front of everyone who mattered in his world. And then he did something neither of them expected. He got down on one knee in her tiny apartment with the peeling paint and the temperamental plumbing and the stacks of medical bills on the table. He asked her to marry him, not as a rescue, not as charity, not as some pretty woman fantasy, but as a partnership between equals who'd found something real in a world of performance. He promised her honesty, promised her respect, promised her that he'd spend every day trying to be worthy of the strength she'd shown him, promised that her family would be his family, that her struggles would be shared, that her dreams, the ones she'd put on hold, would become his priority. He didn't promise it would be easy, didn't promise society would accept them, didn't promise his mother would come around. He promised the truth, that it would be hard, that people would judge, that they'd face opposition and criticism and all the ugly reality of crossing line society had drawn in permanent ink. But he also promised that being with her, building a life with her, would be the first real thing he'd ever done. Grace stood there with tears streaming down her face and a choice before her. The safe choice was to say no, to protect him from the consequences of loving her, to disappear back into the life she'd known where she was invisible but at least she couldn't be hurt by hoping for too much. But Grace Matthews hadn't survived poverty and medical debt and a world that constantly told her she didn't matter by playing it safe. She'd survived by being brave, by showing up every day even when it was hard, by loving fiercely even when love couldn't solve everything, by choosing dignity even when the world tried to strip it away. So she said yes, through tears and laughter and the terrifying joy of letting herself hope. She said yes to the impossible, yes to the complications, yes to love that didn't make sense on paper but made perfect sense in the quiet moments between heartbeats. Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Like maybe some things were meant to be regardless of what made sense. The aftermath was exactly as complicated as Marcus had predicted. Victoria refused to attend the engagement party. Many of Marcus's social circle made their disapproval clear. Business partners questioned his judgment. The gossip mill churned with stories ranging from true to absurd. Society did what society does when rules are broken. It closed ranks and made the rule breakers feel the consequences. But something else happened too. Something neither Marcus nor Grace had anticipated. People reached out. Quietly at first. Then more openly. Other couples who'd crossed similar lines. People who'd chosen love over expectation. Families who'd expanded their definition of acceptable. Not everyone. Not even most. But enough to matter. Grace's mother cried when she heard the news. Not from sadness but from overwhelming joy. From seeing her daughter, who'd sacrificed so much for so long, finally choosing something for herself. From watching her baby girl step into a love that honored who she was rather than trying to change her. Grace's brother flew home from his student teaching placement. Stood in that tiny apartment and looked at Marcus. Really looked at him. Sizing up whether this man was worthy of his sister. And Marcus let himself be examined. Answered every question honestly. Made no promises he couldn't keep. And eventually earned a nod of approval and a handshake that meant more than any business deal he'd ever closed. The wedding planning became its own battle. Victoria made one last attempt at control, offering to plan everything if they'd just wait a year. Give people time to adjust, let the scandal die down. Marcus politely declined. This wedding would be theirs, not society's. Not his mother's. Theirs. They got married 6 months after the uniform tearing incident that had changed everything. The wedding was small. Intimate. A mixture of worlds that didn't quite blend but agreed to coexist for one evening. Grace's family from their neighborhood. Marcus's few real friends. The household staff from the estate. Mrs. Palmer crying openly. Some board members who'd proven themselves genuine. And notably, an empty seat in the front row where Victoria had been invited but chose not to sit. Grace wore a dress she'd chosen herself. Simple, elegant. Nothing like the elaborate gown Victoria had tried to push on her. She looked radiant not because of the dress but because of the joy on her face. Marcus stood at the altar and watched her walk down the aisle, and for the first time in his life, he felt complete. The vows they exchanged were promises about partnership, about standing together through judgment, about building something new rather than fitting into something old, about choosing each other every day even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. When the officiant pronounced them married, when Marcus kissed his wife, when the small crowd erupted in applause, Grace caught a glimpse of Victoria standing in the back. She'd come after all. Hadn't sat in her designated seat. Hadn't participated. But she'd come. And though her face was closed, guarded, something in her eyes suggested the possibility that maybe someday she might find her way to acceptance. Or maybe not. Maybe Victoria would never approve. Never understand. Never forgive her son for choosing his heart over her plans. But that was her choice to make. Her loss to bear. The reception was nothing like the galas Marcus had attended his entire life. There was music Grace's family had chosen, food from both their worlds, dancing that mixed country club formality with neighborhood celebration. It shouldn't have worked. But somehow it did. Because when people come together with genuine joy rather than obligation, magic happens. Grace danced with her brother. With Marcus. With Mrs. Palmer, who whispered that she'd always known this was coming. Had seen it in the way they looked at each other. Marcus danced with Grace's mother, who was recovering well thanks to medical treatment she could finally afford, and she told him to take care of her daughter or answer to her. As the evening wound down, As guests departed and the venue slowly emptied, Marcus and Grace stood together on a balcony overlooking the city. The lights stretched out before them like stars had fallen to earth. Somewhere out there was Grace's old apartment, Marcus's estate, the park bench where they'd first admitted the truth, all the places that had led them to this moment. Grace leaned against Marcus, his arm around her shoulders, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because her problems had disappeared. Not because marrying wealth had solved everything. But because she'd chosen love over fear. Had chosen possibility over safety. Had chosen to be seen rather than staying invisible. Marcus pressed a kiss to the top of her head and made a silent promise. He'd spend the rest of his life proving that Grace hadn't made a mistake. That he could be more than his money. That he could be a partner worthy of her strength. That he could build a life defined by character rather than capital. Time would tell if society ever fully accepted them. Time would tell if Victoria ever truly forgave. Time would tell if the fairy tale could survive the reality of bills and disagreements and all the mundane challenges that every marriage faced. But in that moment, standing together above a city that held both their pasts and their future, none of that mattered. What mattered was the choice they'd made. To see each other. To value each other. To love each other despite every reason they shouldn't. The following months brought changes neither of them had fully anticipated. Marcus didn't lose his business. Some clients left, but others, inspired by his authenticity, doubled their investments. The firm actually grew. Turned out that people respected someone willing to stand by their convictions more than someone who bent to social pressure. Grace didn't give up working. Refused to become someone who just spent her husband's money. She went back to school. Finally. Started the degree she'd put on hold years ago. Studied social work because if anyone understood the systems that kept people trapped, she did. And she wanted to change them from the inside. They established a foundation together. Not the kind that just wrote checks to feel good. The kind that actually addressed root causes. Medical debt relief. Educational funding. Living wages for household workers. They used Marcus's wealth to dismantle some of the systems that had created that wealth in the first place. It was complicated work. Messy. Imperfect. But it was real. Victoria eventually came around. Not completely. Not quickly. But slowly, over years of watching her son become someone she didn't quite recognize but couldn't deny was happier than he'd ever been. She attended the first grandchild's birth. Held the baby with tears in her eyes. And though she never quite apologized for what she'd done to Grace, she showed up. She tried. And sometimes that was enough. Grace never forgot where she came from. Never stopped visiting her old neighborhood. Never stopped taking the bus sometimes instead of the car service. Never stopped being the woman who'd cleaned toilets and maintained dignity. Because that woman was who she was. Wealth hadn't changed her. It had just given her different tools to do the work she'd always done, lifting others up. If you've stayed with Grace and Marcus through this entire journey, if their story has touched you, challenged you, or made you think differently about love and class and the courage it takes to choose your own path, I have one final request. Subscribe to this channel. Share this story. Leave a comment telling us where you're from and what this story meant to you. Because these are the stories that need to be told. Stories about people who choose character over comfort. Love over legacy. Truth over tradition. Your subscription, your comment, your share, it tells the algorithm that these stories matter. That dignity matters. That love that crosses impossible lines matters. Let's build a community that believes in the kind of love that changes everything. Years later, Grace would sometimes walk through the Worthington estate, now their home but reimagined, repurposed, opened up to host educational programs and community events. And she'd remember the day Victoria tore her uniform. She'd remember the sound of fabric ripping, the tears on her face, the humiliation that had felt like it would crush her. And she'd remember Marcus walking through that door, seeing her, really seeing her, and choosing her over everything else. The torn uniform was long gone, but Grace had kept a piece of it, a small square of white fabric tucked in her jewelry box, a reminder, not of shame, but of the moment everything changed. The moment when being seen had stopped being dangerous and started being the beginning of everything that mattered. Because sometimes love doesn't conquer all. Sometimes love just gives you the courage to conquer together. And sometimes, when you choose dignity over acceptance, character over convenience, and love over every good reason to stay safe, you don't just find happiness. You find yourself. Grace Matthews Worthington was found. Marcus Worthington was found. And in finding each other, they'd proven something that society tried hard to deny. That love sees no color, no class, no carefully drawn lines. Love just sees. And when love is coupled with courage, when it's backed by choice, when it's built on respect and partnership and genuine seeing of each other's humanity, love doesn't just survive. It transforms everything it touches.